this event live now on the internet. Let me say, however, that Michael Beckerman is the Carroll and Milton Petrie Professor of Music at NYU and Distinguished Professor of History at Lancaster University. He has written several articles and books on exiled composers, music of the Roma, and Czech topics. And for many years, he was a regular contributor to the New York Times. He is the recipient of many prestigious awards. Harvey Sachs is the author of the standard biographies of Arturo Toscanini and Arthur Rubinstein, and is currently on the faculty of the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia. He has written for many publications, including The New Yorker, The New York Times, and Il Sole 24 Ore, and held several fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities, among others. At the end of tonight's presentation, we can keep talking over a drink on the first floor. Now, please join me in welcoming our speakers. Thank you.
Good late afternoon, early evening, everyone. I'm delighted to see you all here. To anyone who is watching this on the internet, courtesy of streaming, I'm delighted you're there as well. It's always a special occasion for me to come to Columbia. Not only did I attend Columbia, got my PhD here, but some of you may know that my father was chairman of the English department and started a theater program here. So Columbia is very much like home, and I'm pleased to see some of my students and some of my very dear colleagues here. It's really an honor to speak to you all. I feel like I brought you here. Can I get the first slide? There we go. I feel like I probably brought you here under false pretenses. Since this is an Italian academy, you doubtless thought that I was going to be talking about Alberto Moravia, and I hope you're not terribly disappointed that I'm talking about East Central Europe. Even impossible stories have to begin somewhere, and I'll take the chance of beginning this one. It's the night before the Red Cross comes to visit Terezin, the evening of the first day of summer 1944. To remind you, the place called Terezin by the Czechs and Ghetto Theresienstadt by the Nazis was created in 1941 in the 18th century garrison town as a place to keep prominent Jews until decisions could be made about what to do with them. Starting in 1943, the Nazis began beautifying the camp as part of a ruse to fool the Red Cross, who'd been allowed to visit solely because of the presence of Danish prisoners in the camp. The ruse works, and one of the inspectors, a Swiss named Maurice Rossel, even writes that he finds the Jews there a bit uppity, but doesn't think they're in any danger. As part of the subterfuge, inmates have been encouraged to display something like a normal musical life. On this early summer evening, on the cusp of that visit, there's a concert featuring the singer Carroll Berman, accompanied by the pianist Raphael Schechter, known famously as the conductor of the Verdi Requiem performances in Terezin. On the program are 4 compositions: Beethoven's Undeferne Geliebte, Dvořák's Gypsy Songs, Hugo Wolf's Michelangelo Lieder, and the premiere of Pavel Haas's 4 songs on Chinese poetry. And here's the original poster with a caricature of Haas. The poems for the last name cycle have been carefully chosen, based on elaborated translations by a Czech poet, scholar, and literary critic named Bohumil Mathesius. The themes of the cycle are love, the moon, the wild goose, and most potently, the dream of home. We know Haas's dreaming of home because he tells us through his choice of texts and the way he chooses to set them, both seriously and playfully. And his home is in Moravia, where he was born in 1899. A student of Leos Janacek by 1938, Pavel Haas was set to make his mark with the premiere of the opera The Charlatan, a work that is simultaneously comic and filled with foreboding. But the German invasion less than a year after the premiere effectively derailed his operatic career. He was in the midst of composing a symphony in 1941 when he was deported to Terezin. Brünn is about 170 miles from Terezin, perhaps a 2.5-hour drive without traffic, through Prague and Humpolec, past Jihlava and Velké Meziříčí. But to the composer and the rest of the prisoners, Moravia might as well have been the moon that figures so prominently in Haas's cycle. It's my view that a particular vision of Moravia played a powerful role in the creative activities of these composers, and I'll soon take up that argument. But first, I'd like to say some more general things about Moravia, both in terms of its music and its role in the Czech and especially the Czechoslovak imagination. Now, the national anthem of Czechoslovakia was famously bipartite, beginning with the poetic ballad Kde domov můj, Where is my home? Kde domov můj. I'm singing, I was told there was a piano, and indeed there is, but it's behind the screen. So I thought I would save you the light opera of me dashing back and forth behind the screen, and instead you'll have to hear me hum a few bars, as they say. So, Kde domov můj, and ending with the more martial song for the Slovaks, Nad Tatro se blízka. So you, Kde domov můj, da 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 da. So you had the Czech and the Slovak together. One of the loveliest passages about anthems that I know is by the poet Jan Skazel in his short review of the Moravian national anthem. This is what he says. The anthem of the lovely Moravian country, that is not a country at all, cannot be played even by the best orchestras in the world. They cannot do it. The reason is that the Moravian anthem is silence. The Moravian anthem is a pause, the pause between Kde domov můj and Nad Tatro se blízka. So this passage, noting Moravia's position in the center of both geographical Czechoslovakia, I've made a little slide. I've put a moon and wild geese over Moravia, so just so it's a little bit obvious. These two songs as well capture two things that are essential to my own sense of things. First, that middles are often places of secrets, confessions, hidden truths, and whether amorous or political, middles are a haven for those things too delicate and valuable and weird to be exposed to the light of day. Second, Skazel's passage illustrates the way many Czechs view Moravia, which is as a land of small villages, intact traditions, and ancient musical modalities. So Milan Kundera's The Joke, Janacek's Cunning Little Vixen, Skazel's poetry, and even Dvořák's Moravian dances share this tendency to cast Moravia as a realm of the timeless idyllic, pastoral world of latter-day shepherds and shepherdesses singing in archaic tones and intricate expressive rhythms of their shohai and friarečky, their village swains and lasses. The musical power of Moravia had been virtually codified by Leos Janacek, not only in his many collections, totaling hundreds of songs, and his writings about them, but in his own compositions, which drew continuously on Moravian melody and speech rhythm to create music of enormous power. Haas, of course, was a Janacek student, and though he departed from Janacek in many aspects of his creative life, he too was steeped in musical Moravianism, as we shall see in this piece and another one a bit later on. We don't know exactly why Bohumil Mathesius chose to translate just these texts in 1940. Perhaps he knew or sensed that much of 8th century China was like the present moment, an unstable period with wars, brutalities, and dispossessions, which are reflected in the exquisite but heartbreaking lyrics of loss and longing we encounter. So let's begin with the English translation of the original Chinese poem, Hearing Wild Geese. This is a translation by Red Pine. So my old garden is somewhere in the distance. Thoughts of going home never cease. On a rainy fall night in Huinan, from my quarters upstairs, I hear geese. Here's the Czech translation that Haas set. So you can see it's quite an elaboration. Home is far away, you should be home, my wandering heart, on a foreign night in the fall rain, when it is most bitter in the sad cold wind. From the top of my house I heard the cries of the wild geese who have just flown by. Again, it's obvious this is a generous paraphrase and elaboration. It turns out that Mathesius actually didn't even translate them from the Chinese. He translated French, German, and Russian translations, so it's a kind of a game of telephone, perhaps. So let's listen to the opening of Haas's setting. So you can hear that Haas has created an entirely different layer of text. So here's really the kind of text that Haas creates. So home is far, far away, far away. So he repeats certain words and creates an alternative poem. You can notice at the end, he even adds the extra line of the beginning to accentuate this. In the middle of the song, we both hear about and actually hear the cry of the wild geese, and I'll play that in a moment. But then Haas does something unusual. Again, he adds that last line to repeat the first. So Haas has put an individual stamp on the setting by altering the text, and this even before we get to the notes. Now we might have a sense that the speaker, the singer, the composer, the fictional creature created by the collaboration of singer and composer, is singing of home, and for him home is Moravia. But how do we try to investigate whether this is so? Especially because the main motive of this song, and one that it plays an extraordinary role in the cycle, seems to refer to a fragment of the Saint Wenceslas hymn, beloved of both Haas and other Czech composers. So here's So these are the first four notes of the St. Wenceslas hymn. There's one aspect of this song that suggests kind of two folk Moravian reference. I'd like to thank my student Jack Meadow for pointing out that there's a strong resemblance between the opening of this song and the first song of Janáček's 15 Moravian dances. So here's the Haas. Oh, this is the Janáček, sorry. So this kind of lugubrious repetition seems to be right out of Janáček's repertory. And again, the wild geese that we hear in the middle seem to have flown out of Janáček's Cunning Little Vixen.
Ve vysokém tómě svém zaslechl jsem křik divokých husí, právě přilétli.
The second song channels another aspect of Moravian music. Titled In the Bamboo Grove, it begins with a kind of vamp till ready ostinato, which you can see here, and I'll just play in a moment. So this is a kind of classic of Moravian folk songs in Janacek's collection. Listen, and then it opens with this tune. And that's very much like a Moravian folk song. So he's using kind of quotations from Moravian folk poetry in this piece. In fact, again, the opening of the song is couched as a Moravian folk song type. It's the next song that presents perhaps the most intriguing invocation of musical Moravia, and is arguably the darkest work written in Terezin. The song's mystery begins with the title, the elusive title, Daleko měsíc je domova. It's often translated as far is the moon of home, but it could also mean the moon is far from home, and several other things as well, since it has no explicit preposition. It begins with the line, the moon glows from the black darkness of the sea, and by the end invokes the agonizing conceit that the poet can't even dream of home because his yearning keeps him awake. It would be hard to find Moravia in the opening because, as in the first song, the first part of the song seems fashioned once again from this opening to the Saint Wenceslas song. So this is. So those four notes. And then again, we have the four notes. Oops, sorry. So again, those four notes in the bass, which you heard in the first song, now double time. And that is quoting, which is one of the earliest preserved pieces that's considered to be the instigator of the Czech canon, a plea to Saint Wenceslas to protect the Czech people, a tune that not only Haas but other composers were virtually obsessed with, and Haas quoted many times after the Nazi invasion. But there is Moravia in the center of the piece in a way that is quite striking. And it's almost a virtual quote. Suddenly in the middle of the song, the middle of the cycle itself, come these lines, which are again almost impossible to translate. In Czech, it's ruce mé, ruce, kterak ste prázdné, říci to všecko. Something like, my hands, you that are empty, but then in Czech it's to say everything. So the implication is, my hands are too empty to say anything, but it's really quite ambiguous. And Haas focuses on this moment in a striking musical image. So if these Chinese songs might be the second most famous Moravian song cycle, I think this passage is lifted quite consciously from the most famous Moravian song cycle, which is Leos Janacek's Diary of One Who Vanished. The Diary of One Who Vanished is a cycle that deals with the process by which a young Czech boy is eroticized by a gypsy and eventually runs away with her. But in the early frames of the song, the young Czech boy is made nervous because the gypsy is hovering all around him. And so he says, get away from me, what are you doing here? Why don't you go? But in Czech it's proč nejde. Why don't you go out into the world? Why do you stay here? And so that's the line in Janacek. So there's almost a quotation here. Here's the Haas. And here's the Janacek. So if you look at it, actually you take away the accidentals, it's actually the same notes that he's using. So, well, we either can imagine that Haas had run out of ideas and had to turn to his teacher, but considering the tight symbolism that courses through this work, I think there's an astonishing transference that takes place here. So on his lines, my hands are too empty, he quotes Janacek's lines, why don't you go out into the world, drawing together in a particularly powerful way the notion of that his hands are empty precisely because he can't go out into the world. And so he not only quotes this, but invokes a kind of second order level of meaning on this composition. And again, this is the key moment in the cycle. So again, this song cycle is thick with references to home, to dreams, to the moon, and it begins, as we notice, with a titular reference to the wild goose, which obviously in many different traditions, from Celtic mythology to Chinese poetry, conjures up the idea of freedom and things from a distance. But let us leave for a moment my strong sense that the wild goose, the moon, and home are all references to Moravia for later, and turn instead to a work that has no text and no reference at all, really, to anything outside itself. Dating compositions is somewhat of a problem in Terezin, especially for the summer of 1944. Because most of these composers were sent to Auschwitz by the middle of October, we have to rely on dates, if we're lucky enough to have them in the manuscript, without being sure whether that was the date of composition, the date the composer finally got a chance to write down the piece, or whether it represents the date of the first performance, if there was one at all. In that summer of 1944, probably in August, Hans Krasse finished a string trio titled Passacaglia and Fugue. In some ways, Krasse has become the compositional star of Terezin, and this for a work he wrote before he even got to the camp. I'm talking here about the children's opera Brundebar, which is performed all over the world. Unlike Haas, Krasse was not a Moravian. Rather, he was born a few months after Pavel Haas, but in Prague, and developed affinities with both the German and French musical worlds, with ties to Schoenberg and the French group Les Six. His Passacaglia and Fugue seems to be fairly straightforward, with a yearning theme which repeats as mandated by the genre, in this case 18 times, followed by a shorter concluding fugue based on the same material. So the Passacaglia, this is, I don't have the score of this, but you can hear. This is the theme of the Passacaglia. Series of variations. But then something happens to the Passacaglia theme. This is It's an interruption, and I always find interruptions compelling. They shift the sands of the work. They involve some element that's so insistent it can't wait for the right time to come in. So there is this interruption of this substance, and we'll get to that in a moment. Another piece that Haas wrote, probably at the same time, but it's undated, called Dance. It has a middle section like this, which is a kind of So Tanec, or Dance, which is this other piece that he wrote, features this kind of direct speech as if it were sort of a much more musical direct speech is a difficult concept, particularly because I sort of made it up. But the notion is if I'm giving a talk and I'm speaking and suddenly I say, Harvey, I've shifted my emphasis from a kind of general type of speech to something that seems directed to the listener. And so there are a lot of shifts in this kind of musical speech in Krassa's work. But the fragment of it which interrupts the Passacaglia is this, which is a Moravian dance, and which the dance that he refers to is in fact a Moravian dance. So it's conspicuous in its use of Lydian mode, which creeps in and out, and in its Moravian style of rhythm. So the question is, why is Krassa featuring a Moravian dance in his final composition and using it to interrupt both the Passacaglia and the fugue? And the answer is, I don't know. And nobody does either. Krassa's gone and there aren't any answers to come by, but one could suggest that Tanec, the dance, is set in Moravia, which provides the frame in which the other events, which include a lullaby and this kind of direct speech, take place. And following from this, it might be the memory of Moravia, the insistent, obsessive memory of Moravia that haunts both the Passacaglia and fugue, that keeps interrupting it and getting in the way. Before our final example of Moravia in Terezin, it's appropriate to reference a work that, while it wasn't composed in 1944, nonetheless plays a significant role in the activity and memory of this summer. It's best introduced by recalling that on the heels of the Red Cross visit, the Nazis planned and partially executed a notorious propaganda film about Terezin. The film shows happy, athletic, artistic Jews, children eating thick slices of bread, scenes from Krassa's Brunda Bar showcasing the vibrant cultural life, and of course, a cynical soundtrack composed entirely of banned Jewish music. Towards the end of the film, there's this scene in a concert hall.
Darbietungen werden von allen Kreisen der Einwohnerschaft gerne besucht. In einem Konzert wird ein Werk eines in Theresienstadt lebenden jüdischen Komponisten aufgeführt.
That's Haas. That's Palacký. incomplete, I still would maintain it's one of the best horror films ever made. Almost everyone you see was sent off a short while later and killed. This scene, of course, was designed to show the artistic freedom allowed to the Jews in Terezin. It's a sham. The conductor, Carroll, who survived, never wanted to speak about this, but wrote one short article about how they put plants at floor level to conceal the prisoners' wooden shoes. The audience was coerced, and indeed the looks on people's faces are themselves worthy of a full study, making one wonder whether Kurt Geron, the actor turned film director, was actually the patsy he seems. The composition you heard, again, was by Pavel Haas. You saw him sitting stiffly at the beginning. It's a piece just called Study. The piece, too, is conspicuous in its use of Moravian folk material, especially this theme, with the use of the Lydian mode with the raised fourth. We hear it throughout this piece, but even more conspicuous use of musical Moravianism is in this rather mysterious middle section, which doesn't appear in the film. I'll play you just the beginning of it. So this is a kind of typical Moravian rhythm, or really Southern Moravian, Hungarian, the ba-ba, ba, 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 ba. Those kinds of accents are classic Moravianisms that are, I would call, marked Moravianisms. But this middle section, this slow middle section of the study for strings, has its own middle section. And this is the middle section of that, which also is a strange, odd piece. That seems to be a reference to a moment in his opera, The Charlatan, where as this traveling charlatan and his posse go all around Europe, they come to a burned out, vanished village. And this is the music that Haas wrote for the vanished village. So it seems that Haas is possibly suggesting in his final composition in Terezin that Terezin itself is a vanished village. Or perhaps by taking an idea from the charlatan and couching it in Moravian folk costume, he suggests that it is somehow Moravia itself that has disappeared. While I feel reasonably certain that both Krasa and Haas reached into musical Moravia on the basis both of structural and what the Czechs would call mulatto-rhythmic formulations, one could of course dispute this or that point in any of the allusions I've made to Moravia. But with the next and final piece, the last piece composed in Terezin before the October transports, Moravia is not a distant memory, nor is it couched simply as a repertory of tunes and harmonies. It's rather completely present in the title of the second movement of Gideon Klein's trio, where it says in Czech, variations on a Moravian in that song's text. Before we get to the middle movement, we might somewhat casually note that the outer movements are also clad in Moravian garments. And this is striking not only because it's another example of musical Moravianism, but because before he began writing in this style, even though Gideon Klein was from Moravia, the composer he wanted to sound like most was Alban Berg, not Janacek or Novak. So, but this is the opening of the trio, again, sort of folksy. And here's the last movement with the same kinds of piano sonata written 2 years earlier sounds like. So you can get an idea of this turn to musical Moravianism is quite a different stylistic choice. But the middle movement is something different. Not only is it a highly specific piece of musical Moravia, it's based on a song with its own text. And it's a text that takes us back to the first of Pavel Hase's songs and suggests a powerful link between the two composers. The name of the song is Ta Kneždubska Věž, the Kneždub Tower. Note the date on this collection, 1943. It's being collected here at almost virtually the moment Gideon Klein is writing it. Here's what it sounds like.
Ta Kneždubska věž, ta je vysoká, ta Kneždubska věž, ta je vysoká, vyletěla
Here's Klein's version of it. Some real differences between the original and this one. The original, of course, is in usually would have been performed in A minor or D minor with lots of open strings. Klein has moved it to C sharp, and you get this really compressed sound. There's a pedal point at the bottom. The C sharp, it's as if you can't escape. It has elements of chorale in it. It turns the rhythm so that these folk-like anapaests, ba-ba, ba-ba, turn around to become dom, ba-bom, as if they're funereal. So he takes the tune out of the field, as it were, and puts it right into the concentration camp, where its character is radically altered. Now, like many songs, there are many variants, and we can't know for sure, since Klein didn't write a text, which of the many texts for this song he had in mind. But virtually all the texts, here's one of them, here's another group of texts that are similar, feature the idea of the wild goose flying up to the tower. Many of them have the idea of somebody shooting the wild goose, therefore betraying the country, betraying their beloved. And of course, it's in the genre of farewell songs that would be associated with military recruitment. So it's a potent series of symbols. Now, the trio was probably written about the beginning of August. We don't know exactly, because even though we have end dates for the movements, we don't have the beginning date. And we don't know, again, exactly when he began them. I should mention at this time that Krasse and Klein were quite close. Krasse married Klein's sister because a rumor circulated in the camp that married prisoners wouldn't be sent off to the east. So there was a kind of a mock wedding, and Klein and Krasse lived closely together, which might explain Krasse's interest in Moravia at this time. I'd like to conclude by looking at 4 events that occur in Klein's trio to try to create a context for this Kneždub tower that's in the poem and the birds surrounding it. So I'd like to look at the theme, the passage from the first variation, something from the conclusion, and then a moment from the work's core. Well, as I've mentioned, the theme itself is a radical alteration of the original. Again, here's Klein's. And here's Haas. So he's borrowed from Pavel Haas the rhythm, and the three of them actually may have been planning and talking about their use of Moravian rhythms. So this is again a transformation of a rural sort of love and farewell song into the sort of dark and compressed idea. The second thing is that the work is full of secrets. I'll give you just one. Here's the first variation. Suddenly the theme disappears. Strange. The theme goes ba 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 3 2 1, but this variation is the only one that goes bom 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 up, and I think the reason for that here's what the cadence sounds like. That sort of clash of harmony at the end, and I believe that's a reference to this piece. Mahler's music had been performed widely in Terezin at several concerts, and I think this is a hidden reference to Kindertotenlieder, almost as if Klein is saying, there are dead children here. Don't be fooled. A third event that happens is a reference to a piece by Josef Suk, which was also very popular in the camp, quoted by Victor Ullmann and others, called Azrael, written after the death of his wife, has multiple references to the idea of the angel of death. Here's the penultimate variation in the Klein. Comes back as a funeral march. And here's Suk leading not to a funeral march, but to Suk's theme of the angel of death. So both pieces have this unison, rushing unison, leading to some very clear reference to death. The most astonishing moment in the piece, I think, is in the very middle. It occurs in this variation, variation 5. Which quotes and makes references to Verdi's Requiem, which Klein was the pianist for. So it's interrupted by this insistent cello, and here's the passage. You can see where it's written the cello is to be played con sordino, that is with a mute, but forte, and it says over the cello part, con gran espressione quasi improvvisato, senza rigore. So all these instructions to kind of create this moment. Here's what it sounds like. So, like many Terezin works, like Ullmann and Haas, there are elements of collage. This quotation, bum-ba-da-dee, is a quotation from Janacek's second string quartet. But that moment itself seems to refer back to a madrigal that Klein had set the year before to a text by Hölderlin. And here's the moment in the madrigal. I live here unhappily. So we have this direct speech. We have the group says, I'm living here, I'm nothing, and I live here unhappily. And then there's an interruption by the voice, kind of a solo voice cries out, I live here unhappily. And it seems to be the same thing that he's doing in the cello interruption. Even using the same notes, the words nerad, unhappily, are the same notes that introduce this cello. So nerad, nerad, unhappy, unhappy, unhappy. And then we have the outcry in the cello. But it's not the same. It's not the same pattern as I'm unhappy here. It's another pattern. We don't know. It's as if the cello is speaking, but we don't know the text, which is another reference, I believe, to Janacek's notion of speech melodies, the notion that the intonational patterns of human speech are the key to the inner life of the human being. Klein's trio was finished on October 7th, 1944, according to notations on the manuscript. 9 days later, Klein, Haas, Krasa, and thousands of others were deported to Auschwitz, and in Klein's case to a satellite camp called Fürstengrube. By 1945, all of them had been murdered. Thus, all these compositions we have explored exist almost entirely without commentary by either the composers or the performers about any choices they made. All we know is what is written on the manuscripts the composers left behind, and those internal clues, fragments, quotes, and references within. The Moravia that exists in these compositions is many things. We may find here Skatzel's famous pause, or sometimes even in Terezin, a world of rustic jollity, and also peace and beauty. For Haas and Klein, at the very least, Moravia is home writ large, but an idealized homeland about which one can dream, or, like Haas's singer, be too homesick to dream about. And then there is the wild goose, whose cry, flapping wings and weightless flight, plays a role in the drama. Does the goose have any special significance? And if so, what kind of significance? If we follow the strand that takes seriously Klein's use of and attention to the text, what could the words, "You have shot the goose, you have betrayed your beloved," signify? Is there some magical connection that got lost when several stories converged in the making of this song? And are the wild goose and the beloved the same thing? And who in Terezin has been betrayed, and by whom? Is Klein's direct speech in the middle of his variation set an agonized scream at the betrayal by the very high culture which had sustained all three Terezin composers we looked at? Or might the shooting of the wild goose represent betrayal by those compatriots from Moravia and elsewhere who stood by and watched the deportations? And do these visions of Moravia and elsewhere represent an escape from such things, or their ultimate realization? And finally, does Klein's trio provide evidence of a sort that the composer knew about the upcoming transports, exactly where they were going and what was likely to happen to him? We don't know. Our conclusions are both tenuous and in the end somewhat general. Moravia may be the last realm of the free wild goose flying over a corner of the heavens, coming down to touch the tower. But in these works by Haas, Krasa, and Klein, Moravia is also a land of betrayal and loneliness, a kingdom of prisons where that freedom has been lost. And as far as one can see from the hills to the heartbreakingly beautiful fields, Moravia, like the transformation of Klein's theme into a funeral march via Suk's Azrael, like Krasa's dance, perhaps a Totentanz, and like Haas's vanished village, Moravia is also a landscape of death. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. I'm sorry to tell you that I am not going to sing for you at all. You can, afterwards, I'll sing for you, for a modest fee. Music in Mussolini's Italy. Even dictators have problems. The most obvious of these problems derive from the dictator's desire to maintain power. But a more mundane problem for dictators, a problem that probably doesn't even occur to most aspiring young dictators, and one that anyone here today who may be toying with the idea of becoming a dictator ought to take into consideration, is that a dictator's subordinates are afraid to decide anything on their own. They fear that if they make a decision with which the big boss doesn't agree, they will incur the boss's displeasure, with consequences that could range from job loss, reprimand, execution, anything, any of those. As a result, even the pettiest of government decisions are often referred upward from the department head to the deputy minister, from the deputy minister to the minister, from the minister to the great leader's chief secretary, and from the chief secretary to the great leader himself, a slave to his own megalomania. Benito Mussolini's example is a sterling one in this respect, and it was brilliantly described by British historian Dennis Mack Smith in his book, Mussolini's Roman Empire. Mack Smith writes of the Italian government in the spring of 1940, when the Duce was dithering over whether or not to bring his country into the Second World War alongside Nazi Germany. I quote directly, "An exaggerated concentration of power lay in the hands of one man, and this affected more than just the armed services. In general, he slowed up the machinery of all other branches of administration by choosing to decide utterly trivial points. It was the small details of administration rather than the big decisions of policy that mainly interested Mussolini, probably because here at least he was not paralyzed by doubt. As well as being commander-in-chief and prime minister, Mussolini was at that time head of 5 different ministries, and none of the 9 other cabinet ministers would act without his express consent. He alone could decide when the traffic police should change into their white summer uniforms, or when the military band on the Lido should begin its series of Sunday concerts. Thus, on 21 April 1940, when the whole fate of Italy was in the balance, Mussolini found time to discuss and authorize the felling of a tree stump on Rome's Via dell'Impero. On 16 May, since he had to approve details of the Rome opera season, he demanded the inclusion of Tannhäuser rather than Parsifal, and no doubt this was because of some intricate theory about its effect on the public morale. Now, some of you may be thinking, what? A politician who cared about what was being performed at the local opera house? Maybe Mussolini wasn't all bad after all. So I think we ought to back up a bit and summarize the peculiar, fluctuating position of classical music in Italy during the fascist period. Although the Italian Fascist Party came to power partly by inducing chaos throughout the country in the aftermath of the First World War, Mussolini was legitimately appointed prime minister by King Victor Emmanuel III in 1922, and his government ruled more or less democratically for over a year. At the time of the fascists' accession to power, musical Italy was well provided with beautiful opera houses and with institutions for educating young musicians. Milan, Turin, Naples, Venice, Bologna, Rome, Parma, Florence, and Palermo all had major opera houses and front-ranking conservatories. Opera composers wrote in a slowly but continuously musical language. At the same time, however, rebellious younger composers like Alfredo Casella and Gianfrancesco Malipiero were beginning to react against opera's stranglehold on their country's musical life. They called for a great stride forward in the production of pure instrumental music. Even some of their less radical contemporaries, Ottorino Respighi and Ildebrando Pizzetti, for instance, hoped for major changes in Italian musical life. Then there were musicians like Francesco Balilla Pratella, Luigi Russolo, adherents of the writer Filippo Tommaso Marinetti's futurist movement, iconoclasts, experimentalists, and, to a great extent, sensationalists, whose diatribes helped to awaken a few dormant musical minds, but whose works have not survived the test of time. Most of the futurists, and many other Italian musicians, were enthusiastic supporters of Mussolini and his fascists. They were not put off by the fact that during the new leader's first 2 years in power, the fascists used increasingly violent means to strengthen their grip on the government. By 1925, the leader of the Italian Socialist Party had been assassinated. Most opposition parties had withdrawn from or been forced out of parliament. The press had been muzzled, and Mussolini had become a dictator to all intents and purposes. Although opera was a relatively popular art form in Italy during the 19th century and well into the 20th, in the course of the fascist era, opera's privileged position was first challenged by the silent cinema and then demolished by the talkies. In 1936, only 6 years after the appearance of the first Italian sound film, Italians spent about 19 times more money on tickets to the movies than they spent on opera tickets. This development was contemporaneous with the petrifaction of the popular Italian opera repertoire. Although no one fully understood the situation at the time, we now know that Puccini's Turandot, which had its premiere in 1926, was the last Italian opera to enter the repertoire permanently. In Italy, as in other European countries that possessed major opera cultures, and regardless of those countries' form of government, opera was gradually transforming itself from a potentially profit-making industry into an endangered species that required protection. The word culture began to be heard with increasing frequency, and the notion began to circulate that the works of Rossini, Donizetti, Bellini, and Verdi were national treasures, cultural monuments worth perpetuating as such, at public expense if necessary. The fascists jumped headfirst into the fray, many of them with the best of intentions. They encouraged the creation of self-governing opera ensembles and sponsored a plethora of federations, commissions, and consortia to assist them. But this led inevitably to a vicious circle of taxation and subsidization. In 1926, the government levied a 5% surtax on gross box office earnings at all theater events, but not all of this money was recycled into subsidies for the theaters. There is, as we know, no perfect system for financing artistic organizations, and state subsidization has as obvious a set of drawbacks as most other methods, especially when the state in question is run on blatantly anti-democratic principles. Before long, newly created or reorganized government organs began to establish norms and policies for the supposedly self-governing opera houses, which meant that their autonomy was born dead. After 1929, when the anti-fascist Arturo Toscanini withdrew from the directorship of La Scala, Italy's greatest lyric theater, it became easier for Mussolini to deal with the overall question of subsidization of opera houses. In 1931, subsidies became the accepted method for coping with increasingly large segments of all the major lyric theaters' deficits. But the price of subsidization was obedience, not merely to economic regulations, but to any sort of imposition from on high. La Scala serves as a case in point. Following the withdrawal of Toscanini and the death a few months later of Angelo Scandiani, who had been the ensemble's respected general manager, La Scala became a jousting ground for bureaucrats eager to have one of the country's cultural jewels as their domain. Jenner Mataloni, a fascist bureaucrat who was president of Milan's Provincia, like a county here, eventually took La Scala's administration into his own hands with Mussolini's approval. And during the following decade, he appointed a series of minor conductors who were politically beholden to him to run artistic operations. In 1943, a year after Mataloni was replaced as general manager, La Scala was severely damaged by Allied bombs, and its existence was suspended for 3 years. The legend that Mussolini loved music happens to be true. But unlike his fellow music-loving dictator in Germany, Mussolini wanted to be all things to all people. Hitler, as we know only too well, had a fundamental belief, the supremacy of the so-called Aryan race, and a precise goal, German domination of as much of the world as possible. He persuaded himself and vast numbers of his people that they had identifiable enemies, Jews, communists, cosmopolites, whose elimination was a prerequisite to Germany's triumph. And he saw himself as the predestined savior and leader of his people. By contrast, Mussolini's deepest belief, perhaps his only belief, and it was a mistaken one, was in his own genius for ruling. Italy just happened to be the tool with which he could achieve his own manifest destiny. Whereas Hitler was utterly, lethally consistent in charting his course, Mussolini was chameleon-like. His short-term strength, which proved to be his long-term weakness, lay precisely in his ability to adapt his act to the audience of the moment. To the warmongers, he was a saber-rattling, dyed-in-the-wool militarist. To the cultured, he was a sensitive soul who favored government assistance to the arts. To farmers, he was the man who stood bare-chested, helping to thresh wheat during the harvest season. To practicing Catholics, he was the moving force behind the Lateran Accord with the Vatican, an agreement for which Italians are still paying a high political price. And on and on and on. Mussolini's political positions changed practically with the breeze. Before he assumed the reins of government, he moved from a sort of radical, nearly Bolshevist socialism to narrow nationalism, and back to radical socialism. And even as Italy's dictator, he developed corporative policies that were an odd mixture of ideas from the left and the right. Nor did he become a racist until the late 1930s, when he decided that fascist Italy needed to bind its destiny to that of Nazi Germany. On the one hand, Mussolini wanted to underline Italy's primacy in all fields. Thus, the greatness of Italy's musical traditions had to be emphasized, and in this he paralleled to some extent his ally in Germany. On the other hand, however, Mussolini cared a great deal, as Hitler did not, about his worldwide image. Thus, Venice's International Music Festival and Florence's Maggio Musicale, both founded during the fascist era, showcased works in various genres by leading avant-garde Italian and foreign composers. And the Italian premiere of Alban Berg's Dvořák took place at the Rome Opera in 1942, at the height of the war. Such an event would have been impossible in Nazi Germany. Excuse me. Throughout his years in power, Mussolini tried to give at least a modicum of satisfaction to everyone who declared loyalty to him and his regime. The word declared is important here. Mussolini seems not to have cared a great deal whether the declarations were sincere or not, but requiring people to make them was a clever move. Membership in the National Fascist Party was not a meal ticket for everyone who joined. It also made all the members accomplices, whether they had joined the regime out of conviction, opportunism, or purely in order to survive. The Duce knew that if fascism fell, everyone who had been connected to the regime in any way, however tenuous, would be seen as having participated in and profited from it. The situation was no different in the music world than in other sectors of Italian life. Among composers, the old guard that was still active when Mussolini became prime minister in 1922 included Giacomo Puccini, Pietro Mascagni, Umberto Giordano, and Francesco Cilea. Puccini died only 2 years later, but since he had accepted a senatorship shortly after the fascists' heinous murder of the Socialist Party leader Giacomo Matteotti, and since he was an admirer of Teutonic discipline and authoritarianism, there is no reason to believe that he would not have remained an adherent even following the institution of the dictatorship. Fortunately for Puccini's posthumous reputation, he died in November 1924. Excuse me. Mascagni, the composer of Cavalleria Rusticana, among many other works, was the most blatant opportunist of the old guard composers and received huge sums of government money. Although, to be fair to him, it is unclear whether that money was intended only for his personal use or was meant to fund various projects that involved others as well. Giordano and Cilea were not protesters either, but neither were most members of the next generation of composers, notably the aforementioned Respighi, Pizzetti, Casella, and Malipiero. Within this latter group, the most overtly opportunistic was Pizzetti, although the most shocking single incident, in my opinion, was a wartime article by Casella in which he referred to the pernicious influence of, quote, international Judaism, unquote, in music. It was particularly dismaying not only because Casella had always opposed narrow musical nationalism and had encouraged Italian musicians to familiarize themselves with every current trend, from Stravinsky to Schoenberg and beyond, but also because at that time Casella's ex-wife and present wife were both Jewish. Thus his young daughter was half Jewish. Respighi, composer of the ever-popular Fountains of Rome and Pines of Rome, accepted honors from the regime but did not request favors of it, and he died in 1936 before fascism reached its nadir with the racial laws and the war. In addition to well-known figures like Respighi and company, 3 other composers of that generation, but of decidedly secondary musical importance, to state the case generously, were practically omnipresent during the fascist period. I'm referring to Adriano Lualdi, Giuseppe Mulè, and Alceo Toni. Their works were frequently performed because they were high up in the fascist cultural bureaucracy, and musical ensembles thirsting for government funding had to ingratiate themselves with at least one member of this triumvirate. Among the youngest generation of composers at the time, Goffredo Petrassi was an ardent fascist. Luigi Dalla Piccola, too, was a convinced supporter of the regime until 1938, when the anti-Semitic racial laws were instituted. Dalla Piccola's wife was Jewish, and from 1938 on, he wrote music that, although it was not specifically or overtly anti-fascist, could easily have been interpreted as such, owing to its pacifist-leaning texts. The young Riccardo Malipiero, nephew of Gianfrancesco Malipiero, and to a lesser extent Bruno Maderna, were, to my knowledge, the only significant Italian composers who participated actively in the resistance movement during World War II. During the 90s, when I was working on my history of music in fascist Italy, I had a long conversation with Massimo Mila, who was then in his 70s and the country's leading music historian, but who, as a young man who had been imprisoned, for 5 years for his anti-fascist activities. At the time of our talk, he had recently read some of the published letters, groveling, bootlicking letters that prominent Italian musicians had written to Mussolini, begging for handouts and other favors. And he ironically expressed compassion for the Duce, I'm quoting him directly in translation, quote, because he had all those puffed up musicians coming around, imploring and supplicating. In a democratic state, those matters are passed along to the right people. The head of government doesn't have to bother with musicians' intrigues. Well, Mila concluded, he wanted to be a dictator. Nobody made him do it, unquote. Now, regarding Italian Jewish musicians, this is probably the proper moment for mentioning that there were only about 57,000 Jews in all of Italy during the 1920s and 30s, barely more than 0.1% of the population. It seems safe to say that most people living in the entire southern third of Italy or in non-urban areas in the rest of the country had never even seen a Jew. And yet Italian Jews occupied a significant number of important positions in the arts, education, government, and even the military. I am sorry to say that to my knowledge, until the promulgation of the racial laws, there were no active anti-fascists among prominent Italian Jewish composers, who included Mario Castelnuovo Tedesco, Ferdinando Liuzzi, Vittorio Rieti, Guido Alberto Fano, and Renzo Massarani. In 1938, however, these composers found themselves having to choose between internal persecution and exile, since Jews were no longer allowed to have their works performed in public or to hold teaching positions or other jobs that included significant contact with the hastily Aryanized Italians. Toscanini and the violinists Jascha Heifetz and Albert Spalding helped Castelnuovo Tedesco and his family to immigrate to the United States. And Castelnuovo eventually became a highly successful composer of over 200 Hollywood film scores. He also exerted much influence on such younger movie composers as Henry Mancini, Andre Previn, and John Williams. Castelnuovo was a native Florentine whose family had lived in Italy for over 4 centuries, since the Spanish expulsion in 1492, and who loved his city passionately. He later wrote about his departure from the place of his birth, quote, What I felt at that moment cannot be called sorrow, regret, or spiritual suffering. It was an almost physical torment, a tearing asunder, a mutilation. It seemed to be a dress rehearsal for death. And indeed, since that time, something in me has been absolutely dead. Not hope, but illusion. However much affection I have come to feel over the years for my adopted country, I have no longer been able to become attached to people and things. I have lived as if suspended in midair, in a cloud, waiting, unquote. Liuzzi, who was Castelnuovo's brother-in-law, also managed to immigrate to the USA, but soon after was diagnosed with cancer and returned to Italy, where he died in 1940. Rieti, too, ended up in New York, where his works were performed by Toscanini, Dimitri Mitropoulos, and George Balanchine's New York City Ballet, among others. Fano stayed in Italy, but had to go into hiding during the German occupation of the northern half of the country after the 8th of September, the signing of the armistice with the Allies, 1943, that is. He was sheltered in various monasteries, and after the war, he converted to Catholicism. Masarani's works found much favor under the regime, of which he had been an ardent adherent since its inception. He even wrote music criticism for journals that were extremely right-wing, even by fascist standards. But because he was Jewish, he lost all of his positions in 1938, and the following year he immigrated to Brazil, where he became a businessman and music critic. After the war, he refused invitations to re-immigrate to Italy. Music by non-Italian composers of Jewish origin was also banned in Italy from 1938 onward, although the Italians' well-known ability to bend rules to fit every occasion sometimes led to ingenious infractions. My favorite example was told to me by the musicologist Giampiero Tintori, who had been a student at the Milan Conservatory in the late 1930s and who later directed La Scala's wonderful theatrical museum. A fellow student of his was about to play a famous caprice by Henryk Wieniawski on a concert in the conservatory's Great Hall, shortly after the racial laws had been promulgated, when an administrator came up to him and asked, "Wasn't Wieniawski a Jew?" "I have no idea," the student replied. After several minutes of dithering, a solution was found. The young violinist went onto the stage and announced that instead of playing a caprice by Wieniawski, he would play a caprice by an anonymous composer. He then played the Wieniawski piece, which was well known to all the other students and musicians present, but no one said a word. And by the way, Wieniawski was Jewish. But the rest of the story is not at all amusing. Italian Jews who played in orchestras, taught at conservatories, or held other positions in the Italian musical world lost their jobs. Vittore Veneziani, the most important Italian choral conductor between the two world wars and a mainstay at La Scala from 1921 on, lost his job in 1938. During the German occupation, he managed to escape across the border to Switzerland. Cesare Ferraresi, who after the war became one of the best-known violinists in Italy, was a student at the Milan Conservatory in 1938. He was expelled because his mother was Jewish, then readmitted on a technicality and allowed to graduate in 1940. But in 1944, the Germans deported him to a concentration camp, which he managed to survive. Among Italian performing musicians who were not Jewish, the most common attitude toward the regime was acceptance, whether enthusiastic, half-hearted, or unwilling. The only major Italian classical performing musician to offer a significant protest against the regime was Arturo Toscanini, who was already in his mid-50s when Mussolini came to power, and in a sense had been an anti-fascist since before the future Duce was born. Toscanini's father had been a soldier under Garibaldi, and he had inculcated anti-monarchic and anti-church beliefs in his son. In 1919, when Mussolini had formed a new party with a platform far to the left of the socialists, Toscanini lent his support. But when the new party veered sharply to the right after having been defeated at the polls, Toscanini turned against the fascists. His run-ins with the regime began 2 months after it came to power in 1922 and became more serious throughout the rest of the 20s. In 1931, he was physically attacked for refusing to perform the fascist party's anthem before a concert in Bologna, and he made up his mind not to conduct again in Italy as long as fascism and the monarchy that protected it continued to exist. A year earlier, he had become the first non-German school conductor to perform at the Wagner Festival in Bayreuth. But in 1933, after Hitler came to power, Toscanini withdrew and never again conducted in Germany. He conducted in Vienna and at the Salzburg Festival beginning in 1933, but in 1938, even before the Anschluss, when Austrian Chancellor Schuschnigg admitted a single Nazi minister into his cabinet, Toscanini refused to return. Instead, that same year, he helped to create the Lucerne Festival in neutral Switzerland. In 1936, he traveled to Palestine at his own expense to conduct the inaugural concerts of an orchestra, now known as the Israel Philharmonic, that was made up of Jewish refugees from Europe, and he returned there in 1938, again at his own expense. Toscanini, who had conducted the Metropolitan Opera before the First World War and the New York Philharmonic from 1926 to 36, spent the Second World War years in New York, conducting the NBC Symphony Orchestra. He returned to Italy in 1946, at the age of 79, to conduct the inaugural concerts of the partially reconstructed La Scala, and his first official act upon reaching Milan was to reinstate Jewish and anti-fascist musicians who had lost their jobs under Mussolini's regime. During the 1980s, I wrote a whole book on music in fascist Italy. This talk has touched on only a few points within that complicated subject, but I hope that it has shed a little bit of light on one small aspect of that fraught and ultimately tragic period in Italian history. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
We are very grateful for these very interesting talks. I wish to thank all of you for being here. Special thanks to the Italian Deputy Consul, and a special thanks to the wonderful speakers, Michael Beckerman and Harvey Sachs. Buonanotte a tutti, grazie.